Just a nurse. That's what they called her. Danielle Ross, 3 years at Sacred Heart in Raleigh, North Carolina. 3 years of arriving at 6:48 a.m., 14 minutes before shift change. 3 years of refilling water pitchers without being asked, checking monitors no one assigned her to check, adjusting pillows for patients who didn't know her name. They didn't know that her hands moved with the precision of someone who had sewn trauma shears into combat gear. They didn't know that she could read a room the way other people read emails, exits first, then threats, then who was bleeding. The tremor in her left hand when she wasn't working was something she kept hidden, something cold steel and old wounds had left behind, something that came alive at 3 a.m. when she couldn't sleep. But on the ICU floor of Sacred Heart, her hands were steady as a surgical laser. Her scrubs were always pressed. Her badge photo showed no smile, just dark eyes that had seen things no nurse should see and survived them anyway. The morning of March 14th, the shift started like every other shift. Danielle moved through the ICU with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had long ago stopped asking permission to help. Bed 7 needed water, she filled it. Bed 12's line was running low, she flagged it before the alarm could sound. Bed 4 was cold, the bear hugger warming blanket tangled at the foot, she straightened it, adjusted the temperature, and moved on without waiting for a thank you. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical song overhead. The ventilators wheezed their rhythms. The monitors beeped their steady count of hearts still beating. She was between bed 9 and 10 when the doors burst open. 2 paramedics wheeled in a stretcher moving fast, the kind of fast that meant cardiac. The patient was elderly, blind, his eyes wide and searching for something his vision couldn't find. His breathing came in short, panic bursts. His left hand was clenched around something, Danielle saw it immediately. A dog tag. Single tag on a broken chain, the metal catching the harsh ICU light as his hand trembled. His knuckles were white from gripping it. 68-year-old male, suspected acute cardiac event, the paramedic called out, rattling off vitals like a rhythm. Found him at home, responsive but in distress. Heart rate 128, blood pressure 167/94, O2 sat 89 on ambient air. EKG shows possible anterior wall involvement. For access established, 2 liters normal saline running. The patient's head turned toward the nearest voice. "Where am I?" His voice cracked like old leather. "Someone tell me where I am." Danielle froze mid-step. The dog tag caught the light again. She could see the unit insignia from 10 feet away. Not just any unit. 5th Battalion, 1st Special Forces Group. Kandahar. She knew that insignia the way she knew her own heartbeat, not because she'd learned it in some textbook, but because she'd worn it. Because she'd led men carrying that same insignia through a firefight in a valley where the mountains turned red at sunset and the enemy had better positioning, and the only thing between death and her 12 soldiers was muscle memory and a training that never left you, not even when the Pentagon ordered your records erased and your identity buried and told you to disappear into a civilian life where nobody asked questions. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She moved. "Bed 3, she said to the paramedics, her voice steady as stone. "Bays prepped. Monitors live." She was already moving to the patient, her hands finding the guardrail of the stretcher before conscious thought could catch up. The blind green beret's head turned toward her voice. "Who's there?" he asked. "I'm here," Danielle said. Just those words. Just those 3. The paramedics transferred him to the ICU bed with practiced efficiency, moving him from stretcher to mattress in one fluid motion. His hand stayed clenched around the dog tag even as they transferred him. Danielle didn't pry. She checked before access, 18 gauge, good line, blood return clear, and she positioned his right hand flat on the mattress, the left hand still wrapped around the metal. "My name is Danielle," she said, keeping her voice low and level, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. "You're in the ICU at Sacred Heart in Raleigh. You're safe. I need you to breathe with me. In for 4 counts." The patient inhaled. "Hold for 4. He held. Out for 4. He exhaled, and the panic receded just slightly from his features. Danielle's hands moved across the monitors, checking leads, confirming readings. The EKG showed what the paramedics had called anterior wall myocardial infarction, the kind that could kill you in minutes if you weren't watching. His O2 sat was climbing, 89, 91, 94. His heart rate was still elevated but dropping with each breath. She adjusted the oxygen cannula, moved it from nasal to high-flow mask, and the sat jumped to 96. Your vitals are stabilizing, she told him. You're going to stay right here. Someone's going to be with you. My name's Ray, the patient said. Ray Holloway. I was in the army. Long time ago. You military? Danielle didn't answer. She shouldn't have answered. She should have deflected, changed the subject, become invisible the way she'd been invisible for 3 years. But his hand was still clenched around that dog tag, and muscle memory was a dangerous thing, and some bonds didn't dissolve just because the Pentagon said they were erased. 5 Battalion, 1st SFG, she asked quietly. Ray Holloway's head turned toward her voice, and his grip on the dog tag loosened just slightly. You know it. I know it, she said. She stayed 2 minutes longer than protocol required, adjusting his pillow, ensuring the 4 lines weren't kinked, confirming that the monitors were capturing clean data. She positioned his call button within reach of his right hand and explained exactly where it was, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from having trained people to survive in conditions that didn't allow for confusion or misunderstanding. Someone will be here with you every moment, she told him. If you need anything, pain, nausea, if something doesn't feel right, you call. You don't wait. You don't think about it. You call immediately. You're going to stay? Ray asked. I'm going to be close, Danielle said, which was the truth and not the whole truth. She would be watching. She would be the one who caught any change before the monitors alarmed. She would be the one who knew how to read the subtle shifts in a cardiac patient's condition that separated survivors from bodies in the morgue. Because that's what you did. That's what you did when someone wearing your unit insignia came through your doors. She was turning to leave when she caught it, Dr. Ashford's reflection in the darkened window of Bay 3, the chief of medicine standing in the doorway with his arms crossed and his eyes narrowed, watching her with the same expression a predator wears when it's cataloging a threat. He saw exactly what she'd done. He'd seen her stay too long. He'd seen her speak to the patient with recognition. He'd seen her hands move with precision that went beyond standard nursing protocol, seen her adjust oxygen levels and monitor positioning with the certainty of someone who had done this in conditions where hesitation meant death. Dr. Ashford saw a protocol violation. He saw a nurse crossing boundaries he'd spent his career defining. He didn't see the major who had pulled 12 men through a Kandahar firefight with a collapsed lung. He didn't see the legend. He saw only what he could control, what he could document, what he could use. The room went dead silent. Nobody moved. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Danielle could feel his gaze like cold steel on her spine, and she knew, with the kind of certainty that came from reading rooms and reading people and reading the subtle shifts in power dynamics before they became violence, that something had just changed. She'd broken her invisibility. She'd revealed something. And in the 3 years she'd spent at Sacred Heart saying nothing and doing everything and asking for nothing in return, she'd learned one thing: the people who felt smallest were often the ones who fought the hardest to prove they could make you smaller. The morning came with the smell of antiseptic and coffee, stale, burnt, the kind that sat in the break room pot for 4 hours too long. Danielle had been checking the blind green beret's vitals since 6:16 a.m., documenting his heart rate with the precision of someone who'd spent 12 years reading signs no civilian could interpret. His oxygen saturation was good. His blood pressure stable. His left eye socket still wrapped in gauze from the accident that had taken his sight, but his daughter sat at bedside with a worn paperback open on her lap, her voice steady as she read aloud about tactical insertion methods that neither of them would acknowledge as classified doctrine. Danielle was adjusting his flow rate, 3 milliliters per hour, just as prescribed, when the door opened and Dr. Ashford walked in like he owned the room. He was tall in the way powerful men were tall, his white coat pristine, his stethoscope draped across his shoulders like a status symbol. His eyes found Danielle first. Then the daughter. Then the patient. He smiled, but it was the smile of someone about to make a point. "Nurse Ross," he said, voice dripping like honey over broken glass. "Perhaps you can explain why this patient received an extra blanket last night." Danielle's hands didn't stop moving. She finished documenting on the chart. "An adjusted bed angle for comfort," he continued, stepping closer. "And 3 additional comfort checks while our other cardiac patients on this unit received standard protocol care." Standard. Equal. Fair. He pronounced each word like it was a lesson for someone slow to learn. "How do you justify that deviation?" The daughter's head came up. The Green Beret's jaw tightened. He could hear the accusation in Ashford's tone even if he couldn't see the man's contempt. Danielle turned to face him. "He coded risk is elevated post-admission." "I was." "You were feeling sorry for him," Ashford said, cutting her off as if she hadn't spoken. "How touching. How unprofessional." His gaze moved to the daughter, and when he spoke again, his voice had shifted into the cadence of someone explaining a child's misbehavior to adults. "Your father is receiving excellent care at Sacred Heart despite Nurse Ross's occasional emotional lapses. We have protocols for a reason. Protocols ensure equality. Protocols prevent favoritism." The fluorescent light above the bed hummed its electric hum. Danielle took one measured breath. The kind you took before a 40-kilometer ruck march. Before entering a building you'd never exited the first time. Before saying something that would change things. A single tear escaped her left eye. She wiped it without breaking eye contact with Dr. Ashford. Her voice, when it came, was quiet enough that it barely carried across the small room. "Compassion isn't a policy violation, Doctor. It's what you've forgotten." His face reddened like someone had turned up the heat inside his skin. For a moment, he didn't move. He didn't blink. He just stood there, watching her with an expression that looked like fury but which she recognized as something more dangerous, the look of a man who'd been made to feel small, and who now needed to make someone else smaller to get that feeling back. He left without another word. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came that afternoon in the break room. Danielle sat with her lunch, sandwich, apple, water, at the corner table where she always Saturday. 3 nurses were laughing about something on someone's phone, the sound bright and careening across the small space. When Danielle pulled out a chair, the laughter stopped. Not gradually. All at once, like someone had hit mute. One of them stood. Then the second. Then the third. They gathered their trays without looking at her, without meeting her eyes, and left the break room as if the oxygen had just been sucked out of it. The door swung shut behind them with a soft whisper of air pressure equalizing. Danielle sat alone in the humming quiet and ate her sandwich and didn't let her hands shake. The next morning, she came in for shift change and saw the write-up posted on the unit board in the nurses' station. The paper was white. The font was black. The message was printed with the precision of someone taking great care with a ritual execution. Citation: Nurse D. Ross, inappropriate emotional involvement with patient, violation of equal treatment protocols. Recommendation: disciplinary meeting. Date, time, pending. Signed, Dr. James Ashford, Chief of Medicine. Staff members gathered around it like people watching a car accident they couldn't quite turn away from. She heard their voices, low, careful, the kind of whispers that die when someone they've been discussing walks into a room. She found him in the corridor at 8:34 a.m. Dr. Ashford was walking from the east wing toward the elevator bank, his tablet tucked under his arm, his phone pressed to his ear. When he saw her, he held up one finger, wait, and continued his conversation. "Yes, I agree completely. The board meets Thursday. We need to address the cultural issues in the ICU." He paused, listening. "Exactly. Patient safety requires standardization. Not everyone is cut out for this work." He ended the call. Pocketed the phone. turned to face her with a smile that had teeth in it. "Nurse Ross. I trust you saw the documentation." She didn't answer. She just looked at him, really looked at him, the way you looked at something you were trying to remember the details of before it disappeared. "The board will be in touch," he said, and his smirk was the kind of thing that made history. That made wars. That made people decide what they were willing to become. She turned and walked away. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. The tremor didn't start until 4 hours later when she was alone in her car during lunch break, both hands gripped around the steering wheel, knuckles white, her jaw clenched so tight she thought her teeth might crack. She pressed her left palm flat against her chest and counted her heartbeat until it stopped lying to her about control. That evening, she checked the blind Green Beret's monitors from the doorway. She wasn't assigned to him anymore, but she could see his metrics from the hallway. His heart rhythm looked wrong. Not dangerously wrong. Not yet. But the pattern was irregular in a way that meant something, and she knew what it meant because she'd trained for years recognizing what hearts did when they were starting to fail. His daughter sat beside him, holding his hand, reading aloud from a worn paperback with a green cover. Danielle recognized it, a tactical manual used by the 5th Special Forces Group. The kind of book you didn't just read. You studied it. You memorized it. You understood that someone had once taught this blind man how to move through darkness and keep moving. The dog tag on the broken chain sat on his bedside table. The unit insignia caught the light, caught it and held it like a secret. She memorized the serial number without appearing to look. 12 digits. 75th Ranger Regiment insignia. A legend beneath that she couldn't quite read from this distance. She had no authority to act on what she knew about his heart. Dr. Ashford had made that clear by posting her name on the board, by calling his allies, by systematizing her isolation into something that looked like policy and felt like erasure. That night she lay in her apartment, 3 rooms that felt like a safe house, anonymous and temporary and built for disappearing, and stared at the ceiling while her left hand tremored against the bedspread. She pressed her palm flat against her chest and held it there until her heartbeat steadied and the tremor became something she could live with. She didn't sleep. She lay in the darkness and thought about the blind Green Beret's irregular cardiac rhythm. About the daughter reading tactical manuals. About a dog tag on a broken chain that meant something to someone, and about what happened when a person decided that protecting a system was more important than protecting the people inside it. Outside, Raleigh hummed with its ordinary midnight sounds. Traffic on a distant highway. Wind moving through the trees. The small city sounds of people living normal lives in normal time. But in the darkness of her apartment, Danielle Ross, former major, current nurse, always something else entirely, knew that none of this was ordinary. And she knew that 2 days from now, everything would change. The schedule change was waiting in the break room, posted on the bulletin board next to the staff rotation for the month. Danielle saw it at 6:11 a.m., before her shift started, before the coffee had even finished brewing in the corner machine that smelled like burnt copper and regret. The new assignment was printed in the same clinical font as every other hospital directive, but the words landed like shrapnel: night shift. Pediatrics. Effective immediately. She read it twice. Then a third time, making sure the letters hadn't rearranged themselves into something that made sense. Pediatrics. The same unit where children slept in rooms that smelled of crayons and antiseptic, where the emergencies were smaller but no less terrifying to the families holding vigil. The night shift meant 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., which meant she would be exactly where Dr. Ashford needed her to be, gone from the ICU. Gone from the blind Green Beret. Gone from anywhere she might prove herself indispensable. She reached out and touched the paper. Her finger traced the words like reading Braille, understanding the message without needing to hear it spoken aloud. This was strategic. This was precise. This was the kind of move that Dr. Ashford executed with the same cold efficiency he used to write prescriptions, purposeful, documented, impossible to challenge without looking paranoid. A younger nurse, Jessica, came in for the morning shift and stopped beside her. "Rough," Jessica said quietly, glancing at the schedule. "Pediatrics is brutal." Danielle didn't respond. She was calculating. The ICU was 2 floors up. Night shift meant she'd be vertical during the hours when most critical interventions were planned. And if something happened during her shift, the code would come through the overhead paging system, but she wouldn't be listed as responding staff. She wouldn't be authorized to answer the call. That was the genius of it. Ashford wasn't banning her outright. He was isolating her systematically, using hospital policy like a scalpel, making every move defensible on paper. One administrator reviewing this decision would see the appropriate reallocation of resources based on unit needs and staff development opportunities. No one would read between the lines and see removal, punishment, sabotage. At 7:15 a.m., Dr. Ashford appeared in the ICU corridor. He found her at the medication station, where she was finishing her final morning rounds on the patient she would no longer be assigned to see. He held a folder, and his expression was the careful blankness of a man executing a protocol he'd rehearsed. "Ross," he said. Her last name only. Never Danielle. Never nurse. "Your reassignment is effective today. The night pediatrics position opens at 1900 hours. You'll hand off your current cases to Miller and Cho." She looked at him. Waited a full 3 seconds before responding. "I understand, Doctor. Do you have questions?" His voice had that practiced tone, the sound of a man who'd consulted with hospital counsel before this conversation, who had documentation ready, who was prepared for her to object so he could explain, calmly and with perfect reason, why her objection was unreasonable. "No questions," Danielle said. She didn't ask why. She didn't ask who approved the change or when the decision was made. She didn't point out that she had 3 years of exemplary evaluations or that her ICU competency metrics were in the top 15% of the nursing staff. She didn't mention the blind green beret upstairs in room for 17, who'd been admitted with an arrhythmia pattern that made her chest tighten every time she reviewed his morning labs. She simply nodded and turned back to the medication cart. Dr. Ashford lingered for a moment, as if expecting something else. Then he walked away, his shoes making that particular sound against the polished floor that meant he was satisfied. Mission accomplished. The day moved like water through a sieve. Danielle transitioned her cases methodically, documenting everything in the electronic medical record with the precision of someone who knew every word might be reviewed later. She left detailed handoff notes for Miller and Cho. She checked on the blind green beret one final time before noon, reviewing his most recent EKG printout, noting the subtle irregularity in his rhythm that had been present for the past 24 hours. The kind of thing that might resolve on its own. The kind of thing that might escalate without warning. The kind of thing she would no longer be present to catch. She found him sitting by the window in room for 17, his sightless eyes turned toward the direction of light even though he couldn't see it. His daughter was with him, a younger woman in military uniform, lieutenant colonel insignia on her shoulder. They were talking quietly about visiting hours and discharge planning, about the cardiac rehabilitation program that would start next week. Normal. Safe. Routine. Danielle delivered his afternoon medications, checked his foresight, made a note about his blood pressure. She didn't linger. She didn't offer the kind of extra kindness that had gotten her reported in the first place. She was just a nurse now. Just someone passing through his room on her final shift in this unit. At 6:16 p.m., she gathered her belongings from her locker and changed into fresh scrubs for pediatrics. The unit was 3 floors down and a different world, colorful walls, stuffed animals in the corners, the particular silence of children sleeping. She met her preceptor for the night, a woman named Rodriguez who'd been working pediatrics for 8 years and who gave her the kind of nod that suggested she knew exactly why Danielle had been transferred. Nobody moved up from ICU to pediatrics unless something had gone wrong. The night shift was quiet. Too quiet. Danielle worked through 11 p.m., midnight, 1 a.m. She administered medications, checked vitals, turned patients, prevented pressure ulcers, did all the invisible work that kept small humans alive in the dark. At 1:19 a.m., she was in the supply room, pulling fresh linens and gauze packs, when the overhead system crackled to life. Code Blue, Intensive Care Unit, Bay 3. Code Blue, Intensive Care Unit, Bay 3. Her body went still. Bay 3. The blind green beret's room was Bay 3. She was already moving before her brain caught up to her instincts. The linens dropped. The supply room door swung open. She was in the corridor in seconds, running toward the elevator bank, her feet moving with a kind of muscle memory that didn't care about administrative reassignments or restricted access or the fact that her badge no longer authorized her to be in that unit. The elevator doors opened. She stepped in. 6th floor. The buttons lit up. 3rd floor next. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was level. But her mind was moving through the cascade of possibilities: sudden arrhythmia, sepsis, acute MI, a complication from whatever procedure had been scheduled for this morning. The code wasn't a casual announcement. The overhead system was only activated for the most critical emergencies, the ones where every second counted and every available hand was needed. The elevator doors opened on the ICU floor. The alarm bells were still ringing overhead. She could hear voices from Bay 3, raised voices, the sound of people moving with controlled urgency. She moved toward the room, pushing through the double doors, and what she saw in the first 1.2 seconds crystallized everything she'd already understood about how this moment was supposed to unfold. The blind green beret was on his back, chest open to the ribs. A surgical procedure, something routine, something that should have been simple. But his chest cavity was flooding. Blood pooling. And standing at the bedside, holding a stethoscope like it might somehow make sense of a catastrophe, was Dr. Ashford. His face was the color of old chalk. His hands were trembling. "He's not responding," Ashford stammered. His voice cracked on the second word. "The incision, I didn't see, the bleeding." Danielle saw it immediately. The wound wasn't the problem. The problem was pressure. Air trapped in the thoracic cavity, compressing the lungs, preventing blood return to the heart. Tension pneumothorax. An emergency that would kill him in minutes if it wasn't addressed in seconds. She moved without permission, without protocol, without the briefing that would normally precede someone entering an active code. She shoved Ashford aside, not violently, just firmly, the way you move an obstacle out of a doorway. A veteran visitor had left something on the chair earlier. She'd noticed it that morning, an MRE wrapper, the kind that came with field rations, the kind that was waterproof and airtight and made of material that held pressure like a seal. She grabbed it. Tore it open. The sensation of the packaging in her hand sent her back to a place called Kandahar, to a woman named Major Ross who'd learned to improvise with whatever was available, who'd saved lives with things that weren't supposed to save lives. But that woman was gone. That woman had been buried. There was only the nurse, and the patient, and the 3 seconds between life and death. 14-gauge needle, she barked. No, please. No question. Just command. Someone, a Miller or one of the crash team members, was already moving. The needle appeared in her hand like magic. She located the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The anatomical landmarks were the same whether you learned them in a military field hospital or a civilian ICU. She found the spot between his ribs and pushed the needle through the chest wall. The hiss of air escaping from the thoracic cavity was the most beautiful sound she'd heard in 3 years, the sound of pressure releasing, of death being delayed, of the next heartbeat becoming possible. His oxygen saturation started climbing. 68, 72, 78. 82. Sinus rhythm re-establishing itself on the monitor, the beeps growing stronger, more rhythmic. Alive. Still alive. Danielle stepped back. The crash team was flooding in now, 16 sets of eyes looking at her with the kind of confusion that comes when someone does something impossible in front of witnesses. She was out of the ICU. She wasn't authorized to be here. She wasn't assigned to this patient anymore. And yet she'd just prevented him from dying. Dr. Ashford was staring at her. His face had moved past chalk into something else, a kind of furious pallor that came from understanding that he'd been outmaneuvered, that the universe had just demonstrated, in front of multiple hospital staff, that some skills couldn't be erased by a reassignment form. "Where did you?" he started. His voice was barely a whisper. Danielle didn't answer. She turned and walked out of Bay 3, back toward the elevator, back toward the pediatrics unit where her shift was waiting and where she was supposed to be. Her scrubs were clean. Her hands were steady. And in her scrub pocket, pressed against her ribs, was the cold weight of the dog tag she'd quietly removed from the Green Beret's bedside that morning, thinking she'd return it after her shift, before he was discharged, before any of this happened. The chain was broken. The metal was tarnished. And it felt like evidence. But that wasn't the worst part. The code alarm screamed through Sacred Heart's corridors at 2:08 p.m., and Danielle heard it from the pediatrics wing, her current exile, where she was supposed to be changing full lines on sleeping children and pretending she'd never held a soldier's life in her hands. The overhead speaker crackled. Code blue, ICU Bay 3. Her feet moved before her mind caught up. Bay 3. The blind Green Beret. The one patient she'd been systematically restricted from seeing, the one whose cardiac irregularities she'd documented on a piece of notebook paper now hidden in her locker because reporting them to Dr. Ashford would only trigger another citation. She ran. Not walked. Ran. Down the back stairwell, past the laundry room where steam rose like a ghost, up the ICU corridor where her badge, still active but flagged in the system, would trigger an alert if she swiped it on the restricted access door. She didn't swipe it. She slipped through behind an orderly pushing a stretcher, muscle memory from a different life when slipping through doors without announcement was survival. The ICU was controlled chaos. Crash cart. 3 residents clustered around a bed. And there, frozen in the center of it all, was Dr. Ashford. He wasn't moving. Wasn't calling orders. Wasn't doing anything but staring at the monitor where the Green Beret's heart rhythm had disintegrated into a flat, accusing line. His hands hung at his sides. His face had the color of old concrete. In that single moment, Danielle understood something about institutional power. It evaporated the instant the institution needed someone who actually knew what to do. She didn't announce herself. She moved like water through the cluster of residents, reached Dr. Ashford's shoulder, and shoved him sideways with the flat of her palm. Not hard enough to hurt him. Hard enough to move him. His feet stumbled. He made a noise, surprise or protest, she didn't register which, and she was already at the bedside, already assessing. Flaccid limbs. Distended abdomen. Pneumothorax. Tension pneumothorax. His lungs were collapsing under pressure, pushing against his heart, squeezing it closed. A civilian nurse might have called for a chest tube, might have waited for a doctor to authorize it, might have stood frozen like Ashford. Danielle's hands were already moving. There was an MRE on the bedside table. Some veteran had brought the Green Beret lunch from the cafeteria, trying to bring normalcy to an ICU bed. She grabbed the wrapper. Ripped it open. Her fingers found the needle from the crash cart, the largest bore, 14 gauge, and without breaking rhythm she pressed it into the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the exact spot where a person's lung capacity began to matter more than protocol. The hiss of air. Immediate and unmistakable. The green MRE wrapper she'd improvised into a seal, taped with medical tape from the crash cart, allowed the trapped air to escape but not return. A valve. A battlefield solution. A 3 a.m. trick she'd learned in a country that no longer officially existed. The monitor beeped. Once. Twice. The rhythm returned. Not perfect, but perfusing. The Green Beret's oxygen saturation climbed. 92, 95. 98, his systolic pressure stopped bottoming out. His pupils responded to light. He wasn't gone. He was coming back. The residents stood motionless. One of them, a second-year intern named Chen, watched Danielle's hands with the expression of someone witnessing a magic trick they couldn't quite comprehend. Dr. Ashford was breathing hard, mouth opening and closing like a fish, his authority not evaporated but shattered, scattered across the floor like broken glass. Danielle stepped back. Her hands were steady. Her heartbeat was steady. She'd done this before, 1,000 times before, under worse conditions, with worse odds. This was just medicine. This was just helping. Dr. Ashford's face went from white to red. Not the red of embarrassment. The red of calculation. His eyes moved across the room, counting witnesses. 4 residents. 2 nurses. An orderly. Then his gaze locked onto Chen, then the charge nurse Morrison, then back to Chen again. Danielle watched the moment he made his decision not to admit what he'd just witnessed, but to bury it. Resident Chen, Dr. Ashford's voice was strained but authoritative, the tone of a man rebuilding his castle in real time. You're reassigned to trauma. Effective immediately. Report to Dr. Bancroft downstairs. Chen's mouth opened. Sir, I'm scheduled through. Effective. Immediately. Morrison, the charge nurse, the woman who'd eaten lunch with Danielle 4 days ago, who'd suddenly stopped eating lunch with Danielle when the citation was posted, spoke carefully. Dr. Ashford, we're still in the middle of the code. Chen needs to reassign him. Find another attending for this patient. I'm done here. He walked out of the ICU without looking back. Just walked. His footsteps echoed down the corridor toward the elevators, toward the administrator's office, toward whatever file he was constructing about her intervention, about her unauthorized presence, about the techniques no civilian nurse was supposed to know. Danielle stayed with the green beret until his rhythm was stable, until a cardiologist named Reeves had arrived and reviewed her work and said nothing, which meant he understood what she'd done and was choosing not to ask how she'd known to do it. She stayed until his daughter could be called down from the waiting room, until the blind man could feel her hand and know his daughter was there. Then she walked back to pediatrics, back to 4 lines and sleeping children and the fiction of her own ordinariness. At 3:15 p.m., her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Report to HR immediately. She knew without checking that Dr. Ashford had already begun making calls. The kind of calls that required allies, that required board members willing to sit in conference rooms and nod while a file was presented. She'd bought the Green Beret's life. She'd spent her own getting it. The emergency review board meeting took 90 minutes. Danielle wasn't invited. She heard about it afterward from Morrison, who'd been called as a witness and had watched Dr. Ashford present page after page of incident reports, each one citing protocol violations that Danielle had never actually committed, each one dated and documented in a handwriting that mimicked his own careful script. Negligence. Emotional instability. Unauthorized interventions. The file was a work of art, really, weeks of forgeries compiled into a single devastating narrative. A civilian nurse trying to exceed her authority. A nurse who was dangerous. The board voted 7-2 to terminate her employment, effective immediately. Security came for her at 4:22 p.m. The same guard who'd nodded at her every morning for 3 years, name tag reading Patterson, who now avoided her eyes and held out his hand for her ID badge. She removed it from her scrubs, the badge with her photograph and her name and the simple designation RN beneath it, and placed it in his palm. The weight of it transferred. The job left her body. I'm sorry, Patterson whispered. She didn't respond. She didn't trust her voice not to do something dangerous, not to acknowledge that she'd known this was coming, that she'd made the choice to run toward the code anyway. The parking garage was on the ground floor, down the back stairwell again, past the same laundry room that was still steaming, past the break room where she'd eaten lunch with colleagues who'd suddenly become strangers. The fluorescent lights in the garage hummed their endless electric hum. Her car was where she'd left it that morning, a 2008 Honda Accord that had carried her through Kandahar and through Raleigh and through 3 years of careful, invisible existence. She got in. She didn't turn on the engine. She put her head down on the steering wheel and let her body process what her mind refused to acknowledge, that she'd been right to save him, that the cost was exactly what she'd feared, that the dog tag pressing cold against her palm through her scrub pocket was the only evidence that she'd ever been anything other than just a nurse. The dog tag. She'd taken it from the Green Beret's bedside table during the code, a reflex older than thought, older than the person she was pretending to be. The chain was broken, it had snapped during his cardiac episode, the metal worn through by 17 years of being worn under combat uniforms and then under civilian clothes, by being worn as a talisman of survival. She pulled it out now, in the darkness of her car, and felt the shape of it. A unit insignia on one side, a name on the other, information that connected her to a past that had been officially erased, to a man she'd been ordered never to acknowledge, to a life that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. She was still sitting there, 32 minutes later, when the darkness above the parking garage changed. When the thunder started. When the rotor blades began to cut the air into pieces and the world went electric with light. The parking garage filled with floodlights, and the world became daylight at 2:53 a.m. The rotor wash shook the concrete pillars, sent her car trembling on its suspension, and Danielle's hands gripped the steering wheel so hard her knuckles went white. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. The Black Hawk descended towards Sacred Heart's helipad with the precision of a predator landing on prey, and she knew, in that moment of thunder and light cutting through the darkness, that everything was about to change. The sound of boots. Military issue, tactical gear, the kind of footsteps that don't apologize for the noise they make. For soldiers in full combat kit strode through the hospital lobby demanding one name. Not Danielle. Not the nurse. Major Ross. We need Major Ross. The night clerk, a young woman who'd ignored Danielle in the break room for 3 weeks, looked up with confusion. The soldiers didn't repeat themselves. They didn't need to. They were 160th SAW Night Stalkers, and they'd flown 847 miles from Fort Campbell because someone had made a phone call. They'd flown because a single dog tag had been photographed and submitted to a declassification review. They'd flown because the woman who'd disappeared from military records 18 years ago had just saved a life using techniques no civilian hospital nurse should know. The hospital director's office became the center of a storm that moved with the deliberate precision of a tactical operation. The blind Green Beret's daughter stood in that room, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, 75th Ranger Regiment Attaché, and the words came out like a detonation. That nurse is Major Danielle Ross. She was the commanding officer of my father's extraction team from Kandahar. Her voice didn't shake. She brought 17 men home alive. Every single one. The hospital board members sat frozen, their faces the color of old hospital walls. The director's hands trembled as he pulled a folder from a locked drawer, the file that had been buried for 18 years. Now declassified by the Pentagon at 11 p.m. because someone with authority had decided the truth could finally surface. Bronze Star, the director read, his voice thin. The words hung in the silence like gunfire. Bronze Star. Again. Silver Star. His hands shook so badly the file nearly slipped from his grip. 2 purple hearts. He stopped reading. He didn't need to continue. The medals spoke a language that money and credentials couldn't touch. They spoke of decisions made under fire. They spoke of people brought home alive. They spoke of a woman who'd walked these corridors for 3 years, healing the broken and holding the dying, while carrying the weight of classified service that no one in this hospital would ever understand. A Delta Force commander, dark hair, scar through his left eyebrow, eyes the color of storm clouds over the Atlantic, stepped forward and his voice moved through the room like a tank idling in a garage, steady and immovable. Major Ross earned commendations most soldiers only dream of. She's been flagged in every unit's honor roll since Kandahar. She's the kind of officer you follow into hell because she brings you back. He paused. She brought 23 wounded out of an active fire zone using a crashed Chinook fuselage as cover. She's the kind of soldier who doesn't get forgotten. And she's the kind of person who'll still save your life even when you're trying to destroy hers. That's when the FBI walked in. 2 agents, federal credentials, and the kind of authority that doesn't negotiate with hospital administrators who've built careers on institutional power. One of them, Special Agent Rodriguez, 22 years with the Bureau's Fraud Division, opened a laptop and turned it toward the room. Hospital surveillance footage. Timestamp, 11:43 p.m., 3 weeks earlier. Dr. Ashford accessing personnel files after hours. Timestamp, 1:15 a.m. Ashford in his office, typing. Falsified negligence reports. Altered treatment documentation. Evidence tampering on a scale that suggested he'd done it before. We found files on 3 other nurses, Rodriguez said quietly. All of them challenged his authority. All of them were systematically destroyed with fabricated charges. 2 of them never worked in medicine again. Dr. Ashford's face had become something unrecognizable, pale, slack-jawed, the composure of 18 years of institutional power evaporating in real time. He tried to speak. His lawyer, a woman with a name-brand suit and an expression that suggested she was already calculating settlement costs, put a hand on his arm. "Don't," she said. Security moved in before he could attempt another word. The handcuffs clicked with a sound like finality. His badge was removed. His credentials suspended. His position revoked. He walked out of that office in restraints, past the nurses who'd been his instruments of cruelty, past the staff who'd understood his authority as absolute, and every person in that corridor suddenly saw him differently. Not a doctor. Not a leader. A man in handcuffs who'd weaponized fear and discovered too late that fear isn't the same as power. The hospital director's hand still shook as he looked toward the door where Danielle stood. She'd been there the entire time, watching, not moving, her body language the same calm neutrality she'd perfected over 3 years of invisibility. But something in her eyes had shifted. The mask was still present, but underneath it, visible now only to those trained to see such things, was the steady gaze of someone who'd led soldiers through darkness and brought them home alive. "Major Ross," the director began, but Danielle raised one hand. Just one. 5 fingers. A gesture that commanded silence more effectively than any voice could have. "I'm going back to the ICU," she said. Her voice had dropped half an octave. Not a request. Not deferential. A statement of fact. "My patient needs post-operative cardiac monitoring. The next shift nurse doesn't have his baseline." "I do." She turned to Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell. "Your father's ejection fraction is improving. He'll need consistent care for the next 6 weeks, then we'll evaluate for discharge. He's going to walk out of here with his sight in the hands that held him underwater in Kandahar." Her eyes moved to the Delta Force commander. "Sir, thank you for the ride." He almost smiled. "Major, we'd fly you anywhere." The next 48 hours moved with the precision of a tactical operation. The hospital board offered her reinstatement, full back pay, public apology, the works. She accepted it the way she accepted orders, without emotion, without commentary. She reported to the ICU the following morning at 0600 hours, and the staff parted like water around a stone when she passed. The timid nurse who'd been shunned in the break room was gone. In her place was someone who moved through medical crises with the fluid precision of apex predators, who anticipated complications before they occurred, who saved lives not through protocol but through the hard-won wisdom of 18 years keeping soldiers alive in conditions that should have killed them. 6 months later, she transferred to the VA hospital in Raleigh. She took a position in the cardiac unit, the place where broken veterans came to be put back together. She wore her credentials openly now, Major Danielle Ross, RN, BSN, a woman who'd served her country twice, once in combat fatigues, now in scrubs. The blind green beret recovered fully under her care. His cardiac function stabilized. His ejection fraction reached 65%. The day he walked out, his daughter beside him and the dog tag, polished, on a new chain, hanging around his neck, Danielle was there. She'd straightened the broken chain herself, link by link, because some things deserved to be restored. She returned to Sacred Heart 6 months after her vindication, ostensibly to check on her patient, really to witness the full consequence of what happens when institutional power is weaponized against the wrong person. The blind green beret waited in the lobby with his daughter, and Danielle approached in civilian clothes, dark jeans, a jacket that fit her shoulders like it was designed specifically for her frame, the kind of composure that comes from having already survived the worst. She placed the polished dog tag in his palm. Not a question. A completion. This belongs to you, sir. His fingers closed around the metal. His sightless eyes leaked tears that fell without sound. You saved my life twice, Major. Kandahar and here. As they walked toward the exit, past the security checkpoint where night shift had begun, Danielle saw him. Dr. Ashford. He wore a uniform now, dark blue, a security badge, a flashlight on his belt. Not the white coat. Not the stethoscope. Just the remnants of a man who'd learned too late that true power isn't a title. It's the ability to help. His face went pale when he recognized her. His hand moved toward the ID scanner like muscle memory, then froze. He understood in that moment what she'd known all along: power is what you do when the lights are on and everyone's watching. But it's also what you do when you could turn away and don't. Danielle walked past him without a word, her head high, the blind green beret beside her moving with the confidence of a man who'd been restored. Outside, the Raleigh night was cool, the kind of darkness that comes after rain, when the world smells like ozone and second chances. The blind green beret asked what she was thinking. Danielle didn't hesitate. Power is not a title, she said quietly, power is the ability to help. They walked into the night together, two soldiers from different wars, carrying the weight of service that civilians would never fully understand. Behind them, through the glass doors, Dr. Ashford watched, a ghost in the uniform of the institution he'd tried to rule, now visible only when the night shifts changed. He'd held absolute authority once. Then he'd met someone who'd learned long ago that the quietest person in the room might just be the one holding it all together. He'd learned that lesson too late. But Danielle had already moved on, toward the veterans who needed her, toward the lives she could finally save openly, toward a future where she didn't have to hide who she was anymore. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, or if you've ever wondered what happens when institutional power meets quiet strength, please like and subscribe. We've got more stories coming, and you won't want to miss them.